every one of us. I'm so glad Mark's here today. Mark, sometime when you're able, I'd like for you to share with your church some of the things you've learned through this experience that you've been walking through for the last few months. He has a great testimony. I'd like for him to share that with us. This morning, I want you to turn your attention to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, starting with verse 1. The first 6 verses kind of explains why Paul's going to say what he says in the last 4. He's going to talk very strangely here, more like a Jewish mystic than what we would think of as a solid preaching, teaching apostle. He's going to talk about experiences that he has that he's not sure whether he was in the body or out of the body. Literally one of those kind of experiences where people talk today about having an out-of-body experience. Well, Paul seems to think maybe that's what he experienced it well. And the things he saw, the things he heard, remained with him throughout his life. And he's writing to these people at Oren, one among many letters that he wrote to them, explaining why it was that God chose to change him, why God chose to humiliate him and weaken him. And before it's over, we hear the Apostle Paul begging to stay weak. Not many times do we hear people say, God, just keep me weak. But listen to this. Under the title, Paul's Vision, boasting is necessary, though it's not profitable. But I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man in Christ who, 14 years ago, whether in the body, I do not know, or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. Such a man was caught up to the third heaven. Wow. The Jews believe that the atmosphere that we see, they call that the heavens. They also call the celestial bodies, the stars, the moon, what we can see in the night sky, the heavens. The third heavens was that place where God lives. It's beyond any of that. And Paul claims that in this out-of-body experience, or at least possibly it was, he was caught up into that realm. 14 years ago, he said. This is what happened. And I know how such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words which a man is not permitted to speak. Think you know what heaven will look like? Do you think you know what heaven will sound like? Can you imagine right now what will be spoken, what will be heard, what you will experience when you get to heaven? The Apostle Paul said, I was there. I think I was in an out-of-body experience or in-body, I'm not quite sure. But what I heard, human lips cannot utter. They're beyond expression. My goodness. I don't think we have, as Paul said, eye has not seen, ear hath not heard, neither hath it entered into the heart of man what God has in store for those who love Him. So Paul had this great vision. I don't know why God allowed him to have it. Maybe it was at a moment in his life where Paul really needed it. But it changed Paul forever. On behalf of such a man I will boast, he said. But on my own behalf I will not boast except in regard to my weaknesses. For if I do wish to boast, I will not be foolish, for I will be speaking of the truth. But I refrain from this so that no one will credit me with more than he sees in me or hears from me. Now, Paul claims to have this experience that changed his life, that altered the way he thought. And then he goes on to explain what God did. Because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations.
For this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. So Paul understood the cause, he understood the effect, he understood the reason why this problem existed in his life that he described as a weakness, a thorn in the flesh. He understood it to come from a messenger of Satan, but it was by God's permission. And he knew the reason behind it. I remember what that great man of God said when his brothers greeted him when he became one of the great leaders of Egypt, Joseph. Joseph said, "You intended it for evil, but God intended it for good." I don't know what thorn you're feeling in your life or why it's there, but I can tell you what, if you belong to God, whatever the intention, God intends it for good. He's going to cause it to be good in your life. And he has said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness." That's a strange statement. "Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." May the Lord this morning add His blessings to the reading of His Word. There are a few truths that I can identify that has come to me through our many years of ministry that I believe are important. This not only applies to me individually, but I think it also applies to groups of people like ours, church families. And that is this. When you determine in your heart to do something great for God, expect in the wake of that decision a series of disasters. Difficulties that's going to come into your life. Just expect it. For example, just decide in your life, I'm going to do something great for God, and expect the kids to get sick, or you'll get sick. Or the car will break down at the most inopportune moment. Or maybe some people or someone that you're trusting to be an ally, a co-worker with you in this work, they'll either fall, fail, or become unavailable. Right at the moment when you think you got everything figured out, you will discover that you don't even know what questions to ask, let alone the answers. Paul described it this way in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning with verse 8. Describing what has happened to himself and to his co-ministry workers. He said, "We are afflicted in every way." Afflicted. That describes illnesses, torments of the body, torments of the mind. "We are afflicted in every way," he said, "but not crushed. Perplexed." How many of you are perplexed with the condition of our culture today? Anything ever happened in your life in the last week that made you scratch your head and think, I never thought I would ever be discussing this, listening to it, or hearing it, or watching it? I was refreshed, I think it was Friday evening, to turn the TV on and to find for a whole hour episodes of I Love Lucy. It was in color. And it was the story of when they tried to steal or Lucy and her cohort tried to steal a block of concrete that John Wayne had put his footprints in and wrote his name on. And it was an absolute one disaster after another. It was funny. There was no swearing.
There was no vulgarity. There was no nudity or anything like that. It was just funny. And I hope they do it some more. It seemed to me that maybe in my poor, feeble way of thinking, that when that was being produced, life was so much more simple. Maybe it wasn't, but it seemed that way to me. Now we are thinking about things and discussing things that we never thought we would ever discuss. And yes, there are times when it seems that we are perplexed. But Paul said, but not despairing. Persecuted. Being ill-treated for the cause of the gospel. He said, but though I'm persecuted, I'm not destroyed. Now, why were these things happening to a committed follower of Jesus like Paul? Why was he perplexed? Why was he afflicted? Why was he persecuted? All of those things went with him, it seemed, almost every step of his journey. Well, Paul tries to explain it in the verses that followed in chapter 4. He said, we have this treasure. And that treasure he's referring to is none other than the gospel of Jesus Christ. He said, we have this treasure in earthen vessels so that the surpassing greatness of the power of God, will be of God and not of ourselves. Paul said that God has gone out of His way to make sure when the gospel is preached, the focus will not be on the preacher, it'll be on the gospel. In my entire life, I have never saved anyone. The gospel of Jesus Christ, though, has changed people's hearts and lives. Whenever people like me who proclaim this simple message are made aware of scriptures like this, it should bring us to the place where we say, God, I am honored simply just to stand and talk. Because I know that what I'm saying is important. The one who is saying it isn't. Paul said that God has made it in such a way where this great treasure is put, he called it in earthen vessels. He was describing the most commonly used plates in the house. You know those bowls that you don't care if you break them? Those plates that are so old, or maybe they're scratched up and nicked, that if you break one in the dishwasher, it really doesn't matter. Paul said that's what I am. He said, I'm just an old common earthen vessel, but what I carry in my mind and my heart is a treasure of unspeakable value. It's the gospel. God has the power, and it seems from time to time God chooses to show His power in different ways. For example, in Exodus chapter 20, verses 18 through 20, this is how God really strutted His stuff on one occasion. He had just given the 10 Commandments to the people of Israel. They were there at the foot of Mount Sinai. God was billowing from the mountain. And the Bible says all the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and they stood at a distance. Then they said to Moses, speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But let not God speak to us, or we will die. Put yourself in their place. You just come out of Egypt, where God had humiliated the gods of Egypt. He had parted the Red Sea, brought you through on dry ground. Now you're standing at the foot of this mountain, and this mountain looks like it's on fire, and billowing smoke, and flames shooting out, and the sound of a trumpet that would be terrifying. And God is giving His law, and God is speaking, and the people are backing up, and they're backing up, and they're backing up, and they're saying to Moses, this is killing us. We can't even listen to God. He's so powerful. I love what Moses said back to them. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. Sure, that's all right for you, Moses. You're Moses. You're the big shot Moses. Me, I'm just a little Hebrew here, and I used to be a slave. But no, that's what Moses said. Moses said to the people, don't be afraid, for God has done this in order to test you. wonder if God's done anything in your life this week to test you. Wonder if God is doing anything in your life to see what you're made of. Maybe to show you what you're made of. And he said, in order that the fear of him may remain with you, so that you may not sin. God showed his power to those people so the fear of him would be instilled deeply within them, so that they would not sin against their God. I wonder what God might be doing in your life right now to prevent you from sinning. What God might be showing you so that you will not step over that line that you know is there. Well, that's what God did in this case. The thunder came from the mountain. The mountain was literally on fire. I love this where one of the psalmists said this. He can speak and the earth melts and the mountains tremble. That's the kind of God we serve. He can speak and the earth can melt and the mountains can tremble. Or, if he chooses to really impress us, he can place a servant who really is full of himself in a position where he is totally and completely dependent on God. Al sang about water walking God, but he also mentioned just in passing a water walking Peter. He got out of the boat and was walking towards the Lord, and then he started looking around at all the circumstances of his life. Here was big, powerful Peter. Give him credit, at least he stepped out of the boat. But what happened? Sometimes God can use a wimpy mortal to show everybody that he's the most powerful force that anyone has ever confronted. Do you know that? God can take a person that is weak and useless and make them strong and make them powerful beyond anything anyone could possibly ever imagine. Paul had experienced this very thing. You see, when Paul wrote those famous words, when I am weak, then I am strong, he could have become part of a long list of people who could have said the very same thing. See, we've been studying the book of Hebrews. 11th chapter of Hebrews, roll call of faith. By faith, Abraham did this. By faith, Enoch did that. By faith, it was Gideon who did this. Or he alludes to David and what David did, and Moses and what Moses did. I got to looking through that list, and it occurred to me how many of the people who are superstars on that list, by the standards of this world today, should have never been on it. Today I want to give you two. Next Sunday I'm going to give you two more. This Sunday is going to be two people that you would think, oh, of course they belong on that list. No, think about their life. And then next Sunday, which is Memorial Day, we're going to think about two mighty warriors that should have never, ever made the list. First on the list, a man by the name of Abraham. When we first meet him, he was called Abram, and he should have never made the list. Now, by today's standards, do you know why? He was too old. The first time we meet Abraham in the Old Testament, he's 75 years old, and he's living in Haran. And the Bible tells us that God calls this man that lives among pagans, heathens. He calls him out and calls him away and tells him that he's going to go to a place that he's going to show him, and he's going to make of him a great nation. Thing of it is, Abraham is 75 years old. His wife's biological clock has already stopped ticking. He's got a nephew that he's taking care of. He comes from a pagan tribe, and God is saying to him, I'm going to make you great. I'm going to make you famous when he's 75 years old. If you're 75 years old in this culture, you know what our culture is saying to us? You're over the hill. You've got nothing to say of any value. Spend your money and go your way. Go on vacation somewhere. Get your walker and do whatever you're going to do with it. Don't bother us. We've got our own music. We've got our own way of thinking. We've got our own plans, and we're going to go our own way. So if you're 75 years old and older, just get out of the way. That's where Abraham was when we first met him. You know, the next time we meet him, how old he is? 99 years old. Now he's a centurion. He's almost 100 years old. And God shows up to Abraham again after 73 years past, or 23 years past, and he says to him, Abraham, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make you the father of a great nation. His wife is in the tent next to him, and she laughs out loud. You're going to what? I thought this was all over. We took care of this with Hagar and Ishmael. Oh, no, God says. It's going to be your child. Now he's 100 years old. And sure enough, God makes him into a superstar. Why? Because in Abraham's old age, in his weakness, in his inability, the book of Hebrews says about Abraham that he was a man as good as dead. Physically, he was beyond the years. He had nothing to offer. But here we find the power of God being displayed through this man. That when he is 100 years old, his wife is nearly that old herself. Now they have a child, and they call him Isaac because of his name would mean laughter, and his life would just start. God would infuse life in him. God would infuse life in her. He would be known throughout all the world as one of the greatest men that ever lived. And the first time we lay eyes on him, he's 75 years old. And when God really starts working in his life, he's nearly 100 years old. And God is doing impossible things through a man that is too weak nearly to walk, you would think, by any of the standards of this day and time. What did God do? God showed how powerful he was through this man's weakness. God showed how wonderful and how strong he is through a man that was now 100 years old. You know what? My God is the God that creates the laws of nature, but he's not bound by any of them. He can move in your life. He can move in my life anytime he chooses. So let me encourage you. If you think, well, you know what? I'm too old. I'm over the hill. I have nothing to offer. There's nothing that I can give. Let me point you to Abraham, and let me ask you to do something. And that is, go before your God and say, you know what, God? You have brought me this far for a reason. I was talking to a man down in the middle of the square. We was down at the growers market yesterday, and when I met him, he said, do you remember me? And I said, I sure do. Shook hands with him. And he said, I'm 92 years old, and I don't know why God has left me here. And I said, God has left you here for a reason. And he said, that's why, what everyone says, that God's left me here for a reason. I just don't know what it is. I said, have you asked him? He said, no, I haven't. I said, let me ask you to go before your God and ask him, why have you left me here? Because I know it's not for no reason. I know it's for a reason. So let me encourage you to do the very same thing. As you move into those years when our culture says that you have no value, let me encourage you to go before your God and say, God, I know there's a reason I'm here. There's something that I can give. There's some way that I can serve. I told the early service that one of the images that is burned into my mind is that of Mildred Watson sitting down in the basement of our church, sitting down, flat with her legs out. She had called and got Karen, and Karen had got a hold of me to tell me that her hip was broke. We were pretty sure of it when we got there and examined her. But do you know what she was doing in the basement that morning? She was getting ready to clean it, just like she had been doing for many, many years. And then she was going to come up here, and she was going to clean up here, and she was going to go back into the classrooms, and she was going to pick up the trash. Mildred was 91 years old, and she was doing that just as hard as she could do it, because she found no place in her life to give up. She found no place in her life where she felt like she couldn't serve God. Even if it was just picking up diapers and making sure the stinky diapers weren't in the nursery, because Mildred always told me, you can't leave those diapers there because they sure stink after a while. And she was right, because we have and they do. But I'm telling you this, that Mildred offered herself to God. And you know what? You can too. So can I. I think there's always a place where we can serve God in our life. Abraham was a man who had nothing to offer God but weakness, really, if you stop and think about it. But what God did with that weakness was to show how powerful and wonderful a God He really is by working through that man's life. Another man that we could read about in this roll call of faith, we learn about him in Exodus chapter 2. His name was Moses. Moses should have never been there. Stop and think about it. Moses was born into a family of slaves. They were the family of Levi. And when he was born, there was an order that all the male boys was to be killed. But his parents saw that he was a good-looking child, so they hid him out for a while. When he became too old to hide, they made this little basket and put the baby in the basket and pushed it out into the reeds of the Nile River. By the way, there's crocodiles in the Nile River. But there was also the daughter of Pharaoh that came down that day and heard the child crying, had compassion on it, took it into her own life, got his own mother to nurse him. And Moses grew up and became a strong prince in Egypt. Something happened, though, along the way. Somehow, some way, he found out that he was a Hebrew. And one day he went out and he saw an Egyptian beating one of his brothers that had been working. And the Bible said, and this is interesting, Moses looked one way, then he looked the other way. And then he rose up against that Hebrew and killed him. Now you would think if you're going to be a leader, you would have to have an absolutely sterling record. I mean, it would need to be spotless. I mean, if they did a background check on you, they better not find anything like, well, this guy murdered somebody, or this guy was nothing but a slave, and this guy not only murdered somebody, but it was premeditated. And then when Pharaoh found out about it, he put a warrant out for him. Moses fled, joined up with a bunch of Bedouins, married this guy's daughter, and for 40 years herded sheep. Now, what's God going to do with an 80-year-old ex-felon that's now a sheep herder that can't even go back home? What's God going to do with somebody like that? Well, He calls him out of all of that, gets his attention, and says, Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt, and I want you to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. What was Moses' main excuse? God, you know I've never been eloquent. Not now, not ever. I have a slow tongue. I have a slow mouth. I stutter. I can't give a speech to save my soul. Everybody knows if you're going to be a leader, you have to be a great communicator. And here was Moses saying, God, you know I can't do that. God spoke to Moses and said, I know all about your weakness. I know all about your disabilities. I know how old you are. I know your past. I know every failure in your life. I know everything you've done and everything you've done wrong. But Moses, you're my man. And I'm going to take all of those things that you bundled up, and I'm going to prove to you that I'm a great and powerful God. Let me say to you, God knows your past. He knows everything you've ever done, good, bad, and otherwise. He knows every mistake you've made. He knows if you've broken the law. He knows all of that. Yet God comes to us in the midst of our weaknesses, and He says, if you will just give yourself to me, if you will offer yourself to me as a servant, I will use you. I'll use you as it pleases me. Sometimes you will grow through the painful experiences of your life. Sometimes you will grow by saying, wow, God is powerful. But God will use you because He used Moses. I love what He said to Moses.
Then Moses said to the Lord, Please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently nor in times past, nor since you have spoken to your servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. And the Lord said to him, Who has made man's mouth? Or who makes him mute or deaf, seen or blind? Is not I the Lord? I know all about you, Moses. Let me tell you this. Micah chapter 7, verses 18 and 19. The prophet Micah says this. Who is a God like you, who pardons iniquity, who passes over the rebellious acts of the remnant of his possession? He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in unchanging love. He will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. Yes, he will cast all their sins into the depths of the sea. You know where God has cast your sins when he died on the cross for you, and when you came to him in faith, he cast all your sins into the depths of the sea. You think he goes back and dredges them up? Nope. They're there. He leaves them there. And he calls on us to be faithful from that point to him. I don't know where you think you are in your life right now, but I know this. God has left you here for a reason. God's drawn you here for a purpose. Don't you dare give up. Don't you dare give up. Brother John Haskins has told me recently that the greatest years of his ministry has been since he's been in the nursing home. It has given him opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to lead people to Christ and to serve. Wonder what God's going to do in your life. Regardless of your past, regardless of your failures, what is God going to do in your life? I'm going to ask for a song, and